So hello and welcome to another video. It's Friday the 13th, I'm exhausted and I find myself yet again in another cemetery, which can mean only one thing. Well, it can mean several things really. Firstly, it can mean I'm here to do another Titanic video, or it could just mean that I've developed this really weird hobby where I just hang out in cemeteries, which, let's be honest, anyone who knows me well will know that either is quite plausible. I mean, it's no secret that I prefer the company of the dead over than that of the living, mostly because the dead don't have a habit of wandering in and out of my frame every 5 seconds, causing me to reshoot the whole thing, but well, there it is. Anyway, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to episode 3 of my Beyond the Titanic series. And of all the stories to come out of the Titanic disaster, there has always been one that has fascinated to the point where it enters all realms of implausibility. It's a story of a person who throughout her life brushed on the rim of death on more than one occasion. It's a life of hardship, mystery and, well, pure luck. Ladies and gentlemen, I've come here to Great Ashfield in Suffolk to bring you the incredible story of Titanic survivor and the true Miss Unsinkable, Miss Violet Jessop. You're going to like this one, it's a good one. Not the others aren't any good, of course, but this one in particular is one of my favourites. So, yeah, enjoy. You'll have to forgive me. I got a bus here and I'm still getting over it. Oh, Lord Almighty, let's do this.
She was the largest ship ever built, sending shockwaves around the globe. Her maiden voyage would be her last.
I just jumped overboard, down and down into bottomless depths, clutching at my lifebelt.
Scientists of a joint U.S.-French expedition said today they have found wreckage of the ocean liner whose name is a legend, the SS Titanic.
The reason I was in that position on the Britannic was because I'd stayed behind to look after a passenger, you see. Because it was my duty. It was my job.
Violet Jessop was born on October 2nd, 1887 in Argentina to Irish emigrant parents. She was born 100 years prior to my birth, of course me being born in 1987. Totally irrelevant to her story, of course, but there we go. She was amazingly the first of 9 children. Sadly, however, only 6 survived to adulthood. And I think it's safe to say that she had a rather tough start to life. As a young infant, she contracted tuberculosis, and at one point, her illness was so severe, doctors advised it would almost certainly prove fatal. However, against all the odds, Violet put up a tough fight and survived the disease, and had just survived her first brush with death. Unknown to her, of course, at the time, it would be the first of many she would suffer throughout her lifetime. At age 16, Violet's father suddenly passed away, which totally devastated her family. So much so that they relocated to the other side of the world, to London in England, where Violet spent the majority of her later teen years bringing up her younger siblings whilst her mother was away working at sea as a stewardess. However, within a few years of the move, Violet's mother's health rapidly declined, and Violet was forced to seek employment to help support the family. So in 1908, at the age of 21, despite her biggest fear being the sea because she was unable to swim, she, bizarrely, opted to follow in her mother's footsteps and applied for a role as a stewardess. In fact, she had to dress down for the role at first because she was considered far too young and attractive. I mean, I totally get it, I had the exact same problem when I went for my first job. Oh, how I wish that were true. Oh, to be young and beautiful. Violet's first role at sea was with the Royal Mail Line, which serviced routes mostly to the Caribbean and Violet's former homeland of South America. She was at first reluctant to join the likes of White Star and Cunard because she'd heard that the transatlantic route was rather demanding for its crew. By 1911, however, things had changed, and she now found herself working for the prestigious White Star Line and aboard the largest ship at the time, RMS Olympic, which, if you watch my previous videos, should sound rather familiar.
At the time of her sailing, RMS Olympic was the largest vessel in the world and was the first of 3 Olympic-class ships from the White Star Line. Her younger sister, RMS Titanic, would soon follow. On September 20th, 1911, and on Olympic's 5th voyage, Violet was witness to a major incident. As the Olympic left Southampton, it sailed parallel to the British cruiser HMS Hawke. When the Olympic turned to starboard, the Hawke was drawn in by Olympic's massive displacement, and as such, a collision occurred. Hawke's reinforced bow tore 2 massive holes in Olympic's stern starboard side, one above and one below the waterline, which flooded 2 of her watertight compartments. Although no fatalities were recorded, both ships were severely damaged. The Hawke nearly capsized, and the Olympic limped back to port, unable to continue her journey. I shan't go into any further details surrounding the Hawke incident, because I plan to do a whole separate video on the Olympic in an upcoming episode. Violet curiously chose not to include the Hawke incident in her memoirs. I believe it's likely because the incident was so insignificant in her recollection. Her life was never in any real danger during the collision, and as such, she probably didn't think too much of it at the time. Fast forward to April 10th, 1912, and Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage bound for New York. Now, because the ships were very similar, White Star decided to transfer many crew from the Olympic to Titanic for her maiden voyage. It was assumed that because the ships were so similar, crew would be familiar with her layout and the workings of the vessel, making a more comfortable experience of paying passengers. Violet was at first reluctant to leave the Olympic, as she was more than happy with her current position. However, her friends and family persuaded her otherwise, and she soon found herself on Titanic's maiden voyage. Violet describes the sinking in detail in her memoirs.
What was that, Mr. Murdoch?
An iceberg, sir.
Violet was quickly ushered up on deck to assist in the evacuation. She had heard whispers and rumours from other crew members that the ship would actually sink. However, she refused to believe this.
Good, faithful old Stanley, one of my bedroom stewards, came knocking at the door. You know the ship is sinking. Sinking? Of course, Titanic couldn't be sinking. What nonsense. She is so perfect, so new. Yet now she was so still. So inanimate.
She was eventually ordered into Lifeboat 16, which was launched from Titanic at 1:20 a.m. from the port side. According to testimony, the boat was lowered so badly that many of its occupants believed they would be thrown out. Shortly before its launch, Violet was handed something that would bookmark her place in Titanic history.
My arm was suddenly jerked and I turned to see young Mason, who had been busy filling a boat. His face looked weary and tired, but he gave a bright smile as he ordered my group into the boat, calling out, "Good luck," as we stepped in, helped by his willing, guiding hand. Then young Mason hailed me and held something up, calling as he prepared to throw it, "Look after this, will you?" And I reached out to receive somebody's forgotten baby in my arms. I started unconsciously to count the decks by the rows of lights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stopped. Surely I had miscounted. I went over them again more carefully, hushing the whimpering baby meanwhile. No, I had made no mistake. There were only 5 decks now. Then I started all over again. Only 4 now. With a thundering roar of underwater explosions, our proud ship, our beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom.
So Violet had fortuitously survived the greatest maritime disaster of the 20th century. And on the morning of April 15th, 1912, just hours after the Titanic went down, the steamship Carpathia was spotted just upon the horizon. With the dawning sun, rescue had finally arrived. Of course, for many, it had simply come too late. Once on board the rescue ship, the baby that Violet had been cradling all night long was suddenly snatched from her arms by an unknown woman. She never saw the pair again, and in the chaos and confusion of the situation, the infant soon slipped from her mind. Now, the disaster, of course, had unnerved Violet, and she describes her reluctance to return to sea. However, she needed to work, she needed some form of income. So for her, it was simply a case of, well, she had no choice. And within a few weeks of the inquiry into the disaster, she was back out on open waters. Now, I'd love to say at this point that it would be plain sailing from her for here on outwards, but of course at this point in history, tensions between rivaling countries was mounting, and within a few years of the Titanic sinking, the world would be at war. This of course would have dire consequences for Violet, and she soon found herself at the mercy of the great ocean once again. This time, however, she would find herself in an even more serious situation than she had done on the Titanic previously. And in an eerie twist of fate, it would be on board Titanic's younger sister ship, the Britannic. And I've just got wet feet. Oh, that's the definition of irony right there.
The outbreak of World War I meant that many civilian ships were commandeered by the British government to serve as either troop transporters or hospital vessels. RMS Britannic, the third sister to the Olympic-class fleet and the younger sister to the Olympic and the Titanic, was launched just months before the outbreak of war on the 26th of February 1914. She was therefore quickly called upon for service, and before a single pan passenger had even stepped on board, her ornate features and luxurious fittings were set aside. Instead, she was filled with over 3,000 hospital beds, her staterooms were converted into operating theatres, and medical supplies lined the walls. Her hull was also painted white with green stripes and red crosses, identifying her as His Majesty's hospital ship, Britannic. During the conflict, Violet had taken a position as a stewardess for the British Red Cross, and you guessed it, completed the trio by being assigned to the Britannic. On the morning of November 21st, 1916, she would again come toe-to-toe with death. At 12 minutes past 8, a huge explosion rocked the ship as she struck an underwater mine on her starboard side of the Greek island of Kea. The explosion twisted the hull slightly and warped her frame. Although the order was given to close the watertight doors, we know of at least one door that had become jammed in its tracks in the full open position, allowing the water to travel freely between the two compartments. Despite the crew's best efforts, from this point onwards, Britannic was doomed. Captain Charles Bartlett kept the engines running and tried to save his ship by beaching it on a nearby island. The order had not yet been given to lower any lifeboats, however several crew members in their panic had taken it upon themselves to abandon ship. It would have tragic consequences. As Britannic listed to starboard and her bow sunk lower into the sea, her port propeller breached the surface, churning furiously as it pushed the hulk of the ship forward in a bid to save her, drawing anyone and anything into its swirling mass. Violet, having been caught up in the confusion, found herself in one of the few lifeboats that had been launched. Once in the water, she found herself in a horrifying situation.
It was extraordinary to find myself, within a few minutes, almost the only occupant of the boat. I turned around and saw Britannic's huge blades churning and mincing. Everything near them, men, boats, everything was just one ghastly whirl. In another moment, I would be under those blades. Unless... I have always been afraid of the water. I'd not learned to swim. Then, I just jumped overboard. Down and down into bottomless depths, clutching at my life belt. Why had I put it on over my coat was one thought as I felt its weight dragging me down deeper. There was another terrific crash above me, and something struck the back of my head. My brain shook. Panic seized me, and I groped blindly in that water. The first thing my eyes beheld was a head near me. A head split open like a sheep's head, served by the butcher. All around were limbs, wrenched out as if some giant had torn them in his rage. The dead floated by so peacefully. There were men coming up, only to go down again for the last time.
The Britannic sank in just 55 minutes, and of the 1,065 people on board, 30 men were sadly lost. The sinking of the Britannic is of course complex and probably warrants an entire video just on its own. However, to remain on topic at this point, we shall, for the time being at least, put the Britannic aside for no doubt a later episode in the series. For Violet, she had just survived another major shipwreck. However, she fared far worse in this one than she had done in the Titanic disaster several years previously. She had badly injured her leg, and unknown to her at the time, the blow she received to the head had actually fractured her skull, an issue that would go undiagnosed for many years and would plague her for the rest of her life. Of course, her injuries and war meant that she could not return to sea for several years, so she took up employment at the London branch of Banco Españo, an Argentinian banking firm, where she put her native tongue to good use. It wasn't until around 4 years later, in the year 1920, that she took to the sea once more and rejoined the White Star Line, signing up for her original ship, the Olympic. Which, if you think about it in itself, is rather fascinating. She had survived the sinking of the Titanic and the Britannic, and here she was signing up for the Olympic, the only surviving member of the Olympic class fleet. It must have been rather daunting for her stepping on board this vessel for the first time in 4 years. Although reading her memoirs, she often speaks fondly of her time on board the Olympic. So as daunting as it must have been, it must have also been somewhat of a comfort for her. But of course, at this point, one can only assume. Violet spent the rest of her working life mainly at sea. Switching between operating lines, she sailed around the world on more than one occasion, visiting hundreds of countries and meeting literally thousands of people. Very few, of course, had any idea of her involvement with the Titanic or the Britannic, because she chose to keep those aspects of her life relatively private. During the Second World War, she, unsurprisingly, given her experiences aboard Britannic, opted to remain ashore and took up mainly office work. However, with no pension and her wartime employment eventually drying up, the sea called once more, and at the age of 61, she signed on for one final time. In 1950, she'd hung up a stewardess's apron for good and retired here to Great Ashfield in Suffolk. In fact, she retired to this very cottage just behind me here, and I'm quite excited today because this is the first time I've ever visited her cottage, mainly because its exact location eluded me. In truth, I never really went looking for it, but after a bit of in-depth research, I found it. I shan't give its exact location, of course, out of respect for its current owners, but let's just say, if like me you can't drive, it's a very long walk from any form of civilization. In fact, it took me less time to get from my home to the local train station than it did to get from it to here. And I use the term local loosely because it definitely is not that.
Now, of course, I didn't actually get to go inside her former home because, of course, it is owned by someone else now. And I didn't want to start going photographing through windows because that no doubtedly would lead to my arrest. And I don't really have the face or the mentality for prison. I just wouldn't do well in that situation. However, the current owner did actually come outside and speak to me. She was a very, very lovely lady, very welcoming, very understanding of what I was doing. And we had a brief chat about Violet and the cottage and its connections to the Titanic. She also explained to me how the blue plaque that you see here was only attached a few summers ago. Thanks to the wonders of the internet, however, I was actually able to look up when the property was last sold. And luckily for me, there were some images attached to the listing. So here we go. This is what the property looked like on the inside the last time it was on the market. Apart from the furniture and the decor, I doubt much has changed since the time when Violet lived in it. The listing also had its current estimated market value, and let's just say, in my current position, chances of me owning said property are slim. Like, very slim. Invisible. None, basically. None.
Violet enjoyed a relatively long and carefree retirement here, but she did struggle slightly financially, and she opted to raise hens here in a bid to generate some form of income. Her sister lived 18 miles away on the other side of Bury St Edmunds, so even though she was in old age at this point, she decided to take up driving. Her family did mention her remarkable driving abilities. However, sadly, on one occasion, under no fault of her own, she was involved in a car accident which wrote off her vehicle and ended her desire to drive. She instead opted to rely on the local bus services to get her about, which, by the looks of it, yeah, they aren't that great. I fear she may have struggled. Violet had put the majority of her sea disasters behind her, with them being nothing more than just a memory. However, the Titanic wasn't quite done with her just yet, as she discovered on one eerie occasion that took place in this very cottage behind me in the dead of night. Spooky. On one particular stormy night, Violet was awoken by a sudden yet familiar disturbance. Often during heavy thunderstorms, lightning would strike her phone line, causing her phone to spontaneously burst into life. She had learned to ignore it and she thought little of it. However, on this occasion her phone continued to ring. When she picked up the receiver, she was therefore startled to hear that of a female voice. "Is this Violet Jessop?" the caller asked. "Yes, who's calling?" Violet queried. "Is this Violet Jessop, the stewardess of the Titanic, who rescued a baby?" "Yes," Violet responded, slightly irritated. "Who is this? What do you want?" After a brief pause, the caller then said, "Well, I was that baby." The caller then abruptly hung up. The call troubled Violet somewhat, and when she mentioned it to her friend sometime later as part of her memoirs, he surmised it was likely kids from the local village playing a joke on her. However, she deemed this impossible. It's true locals did know her as the lady that had survived the Titanic, but that's as far as it went. Up until this point in her life, she had never told anyone the story of how she cradled a baby on that cold April night. Not to anyone. So was the caller genuine? Sadly, it seems unlikely. I'd like to believe so because it makes such a fascinating story, but it would have been very difficult for the infant to learn of Violet's identity, let alone track her down to a small, remote village in the Suffolk countryside. Of course, I have no evidence to support or oppose the caller's identity, so I suppose it will forever remain a case of, we'll never know. In the spring of 1971, Violet suffered a fall at home which left her with a broken hip. She laid helpless overnight and wasn't found till the following morning when a friend just luckily happened to pop by to pay her a visit. Her friend summoned an ambulance and Violet spent the next few weeks in hospital where she was visited by several family members, including her nieces who'd come up from London to be by her side. They described her as being in good spirits. Sadly, however, Violet struggled to recover from her fall, and several weeks later, on the 5th of May 1971, at the age of 83, Violet Jessop passed away from heart failure. Thanks to the kindness of the local vicar, Violet is buried here next to her beloved sister in the Hartis churchyard just south of Bury St Edmunds and around 20 miles from her former cottage home in Great Ashfield. For me, Violet's story is one of complete amazement because if you think about it, what are the chances of her being on board all three Olympic-class ships when they met some form of disaster, let alone to survive the sinking of the Titanic and the Britannic? I think even if you take the Titanic out of the equation, her life is so full of ups and downs, from her life-threatening disease in her youth, right up until her financial difficulties in her older age. Of course, this has just been a brief overview of Violet's life, and I've included what I thought was mostly relevant for this video. But if you're interested, I really would encourage you to pick up a copy of her memoirs. I've read it several times from cover to cover, and it really is a fascinating read and a great insight, not into just Violet's life, of course, but that period in time. This video for me has been kind of a special one, and one that I'd planned to do very early on in the series. I've been into Titanic since I was a young lad, as far back as I can remember, as most people know. And Violet's story has been one that has stuck with me right from the very beginning. When I read Violet's name for the very first time, I was completely captivated by her story. Of course, I'm in no way related to Violet, but I feel I know her story so well, I could almost consider her a close member of my family, like an extended aunt or an adopted grandmother. It's just a shame that we come from different time periods, because I really would have loved to have sat down with her over a cup of tea and just listened to her endless stories. Sadly, of course, that can never be. Thankfully, though, through her memoirs and her eyewitness accounts, her name and her memory will live on, and Violet Jessop will forever remain, in the Titanic universe at least, an A-list name. So that is pretty much it from me and Violet here in Hartis in Suffolk. I'm going to wrap things up now because it has started to rain. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please subscribe for future content and future episodes coming very soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you on the next video. Have a great day. Goodbye, my friends. See you, Violet. How many more cars want to drive by? Honestly, it's like the M25. Anything else? Boeing 747? Christ, sorry, I shouldn't curse in a cemetery. And within a few weeks of the inquiry into the disaster, she was